The neon sign above the door hummed with a rhythmic, low-frequency buzz that vibrated through the counter. Jake Thompson wiped the laminate surface for the third time in an hour, the rag catching on patches of dried grease. Outside, the interstate roared. A constant, low-pitched rumble of diesel engines shook the floorboards, signaling a world that was moving, shifting, and arriving somewhere else. Here, nothing moved. The stools remained empty, their chrome legs reflecting the flickering blue light of the sign. Jake looked toward the soda machine. His reflection stared back from the dark glass, a figure standing amidst the smell of burnt coffee and floor cleaner. He reached for a stack of napkins, his movements mechanical, precise, and entirely hollow. He watched a semi-truck pull into the lot, its headlights sweeping across the parking lot, and then vanishing as the driver killed the engine. The driver would come in, order a coffee, and leave. Jake would wipe the counter, count the register, and wait for the sun to rise. The engine noise died down, leaving only the hum of the cooling units and the ticking of the wall clock. Every shift felt like a loop closing in on itself, a cycle of cleaning spills that would only return the next day. The next Tuesday, while scrubbing a stubborn stain in the corner booth, Jake noticed something wedged between the seat and the wall. It was a book. The cover was worn, the corners bent from repeated use. He pulled it free, expecting a discarded thriller left by a hurried driver. Instead, he saw the name Napoleon Hill embossed on the spine. He carried it to the back, away from the hum of the cooling units. The break room was small, lit by a single flickering fluorescent bulb that cast sharp shadows across the metal table. He sat down and opened to the first chapter. The pages were thin, smelling of dust and age. He leaned forward, his thumb tracing the ink of a single line. "Your circumstances do not determine your destiny." He read the words once, then again. He looked up at the blank wall, then back at the page. The roar of the interstate outside seemed to drop away. The repetitive cycle of the shift, the grease, the constant cleanup, it all suddenly appeared as a temporary condition rather than a permanent state. He did not close the book. He turned the page, his eyes fixed on the text, while his fingers gripped the edge of the table, testing the pressure of his own resolve. Jake did not head to his bed when he finished his shift. The clock on the wall read 3 in the morning when he sat at his scarred wooden desk. He pulled out a stained notepad and a ballpoint pen. He started with the numbers that had haunted him for years. He listed his credit card debts, his overdue utility bills, and the exact amount remaining in his savings account. The ink bled into the cheap paper as he pressed down, listing every dollar he owed against every dollar he earned. He worked for hours, calculating the math of his survival. He divided his next paycheck into rigid categories: rent, food, and debt repayment. He crossed out expenses that were not essential, drawing thick lines through items he no longer allowed himself. His breathing slowed as the columns began to align. He was no longer just a worker cleaning up after others. He was now the administrator of his own recovery. He finished the list, set the pen down, and stared at the final line of his plan. The numbers were small, but they were his own. He was no longer drifting. He had a map, and for the first time, he knew exactly how much distance stood between his current life and the one he intended to build. The next morning, the break room air felt heavy. Jake sat at the end of the long laminate table. A thick manual on real estate finance opened before him. While he traced the mechanics of compound interest, a group of coworkers slumped into the nearby chairs. Cards slapped against the tabletop with a rhythmic, sharp sound. They laughed, the noise rising to fill the small room. One of them nudged Jake, pointing at the dense charts in his book, and asked if he was planning to buy the whole interstate. Jake did not look up. He did not defend his choice or return the banter. He shifted his weight, turning a page with a steady, deliberate motion. He focused on the text, absorbing the logic of debt-to-income ratios while the card game spiraled into loud arguments over stakes. The mockery drifted around him like smoke, but it did not stick. He kept his head down, his finger pinning a complex diagram to the paper, shielding his work from their view. Every minute spent in that room was a calculation, a deliberate rejection of the cycle his peers accepted as reality. He remained in the center of the noise, yet entirely removed, building the foundation of his exit one page at a time. The process began on a Tuesday with a $50 deposit. Jake opened his first brokerage account, the screen glowing in the dim light of his small room. It was not a fortune, but it was the first piece of capital that belonged entirely to his future. To keep the momentum, he had to find more. He started skipping his lunches at the truck stop. By noon, his stomach would cramp, a sharp, hollow ache that reminded him of the sacrifice. He drank water from the fountain instead, ignoring the gnawing hunger as he watched the clock. Every dollar he didn't spend on a sandwich went directly into the account. He checked the balance every evening, his eyes scanning the columns for changes. For weeks, the numbers barely moved. Then, a dividend hit. A few pennies added to the total. He stared at the increase, the physical hunger in his gut forgotten for a moment. It was slow, agonizingly incremental, yet it was progress. He saw the numbers grow first by cents, then by single dollars. Each addition was a victory, a tangible result of his discipline. He was trading the comfort of a full stomach for the reality of a growing asset, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his own potential. Months bled into years. Jake no longer needed to look at the manual to understand the formulas. He memorized the logic of Warren Buffett until the principles of consistency became his own internal compass. His lunch hour became a ritual of precision. He sat in the same corner booth, his calculator tapping out rhythms against the laminate. One afternoon, a long-haul driver slid into the opposite seat, watching the numbers flash across the screen. The man laughed, asking why Jake was wasting his break counting digits that would never be his. Jake did not snap back. He did not look for an excuse. He set the calculator down, placed his palms flat on the table, and leaned forward until he was inches from the driver. "I am not working here forever," Jake said, his voice stripped of all doubt. The driver stopped drumming his fingers on the table. The air in the booth suddenly felt thin, charged with a certainty that had no place in a truck stop. Jake held his gaze, his eyes hard and unblinking. "But the person I am becoming right now will ensure I never have to look back." He picked up his calculator, returned to his work, and left the driver staring into a silence that felt final. The investment was a wreck of peeling paint and leaking pipes, a shell of a house that demanded everything he had left. Every Friday night, Jake left the truck stop and drove straight to the property. He spent his weekends on his knees, his hands raw and stained with industrial sealant. He learned to sweat copper joints and patch drywall until his shoulders burned with a dull, constant ache. The double life began to take its toll. His alarm clock felt like an enemy, ringing at hours that blurred together. He would finish a 12-hour shift at the counter, his feet swollen, only to drive to the house to clear a drain or sand a floorboard. There were moments of sheer, blinding exhaustion where he sat on the cold concrete of the unfinished kitchen, his hands trembling as he gripped a wrench. The pressure was a physical weight, a tightening in his chest that made every breath feel labored. Yet, he did not stop. He wiped the grime from his face, stood up on shaky legs, and picked up the hammer again. He was building a wall between his current life and his future, and every nail he drove was a strike against the cycle he was desperate to break. By the 5th year, the math finally shifted. The monthly rent checks from the house and the dividends from his brokerage account began to mirror the numbers on his truck stop paycheck. He stood at a threshold where his labor was no longer the primary engine of his survival. A lesser man would have bought a new car or moved to a better apartment. Jake did neither. He looked at the extra income and funneled every cent back into the market. He lived as if he were still earning the minimum, his diet and habits remaining identical to his first year of struggle. This was the turning point. The momentum of his capital was no longer a trickle. It had become a landslide. Every dollar he reinvested began to pull in its own weight, creating a cycle that no longer required his direct intervention to grow. He watched the balance sheets with the intensity of a predator, ensuring that not a single penny leaked into comfort. His life remained small, cramped, and focused, but his portfolio was expanding with a mathematical hunger that nothing could stop. He was no longer working for money. He was watching money work for him, waiting for the inevitable moment when the two lines on his graph would disconnect for good. The interstate was quiet that winter night. The usual hum of diesel engines reduced to a faint vibration beneath the floorboards. Jake sat in the back office, the air in the room cold enough to see his breath. He pulled his laptop onto the scarred desk. The screen flickered to life, casting a stark white light across the cramped space. He opened the browser, navigated to his primary brokerage portal, and entered his credentials. His hands were steady, though his pulse hammered against his ribs. The dashboard loaded, displaying the summary of his holdings. He scanned the rows of assets, the dividends, and the compounding growth he had tracked for years. Then, his eyes locked onto the bottom line. The number was clear, precise, and impossible to mistake. 7 figures. He blinked, looking away, then looked back at the screen to confirm the digit placement. It was still there. The weight of the last decade, the long shifts, the skipped meals, and the relentless focus vanished in a single pulse of realization. He was no longer bound to the counter or the clock. The struggle that had defined his existence for 10 years had finally hit its absolute, irreversible end. He sat back, the chair groaning under his weight, watching the cursor blink on the dashboard as the reality of his freedom settled into the room. Jake closed the laptop lid with a soft click. The screen went dark, and the office returned to its original, dim state. He stood up, his joints stiff from hours of sitting. He reached for the apron tied around his waist, unknotted the worn strings, and laid it flat on the counter. The grease-stained fabric remained where he placed it, a discarded skin of a person he no longer inhabited. He turned, walked through the break room, and pushed open the front door. The winter air hit him instantly, sharp and clean, biting against his cheeks. He took a long, steady breath, the cold rushing into his lungs. The neon sign hummed above the entrance, its blue light flickering over the empty asphalt of the parking lot. He walked toward the edge of the lot, his boots crunching against the frozen gravel. Behind him, the truck stop remained, still waiting for the next shift, the next customer, and the next cycle. He did not look back. He reached his car, started the engine, and pulled onto the highway. The road ahead was dark, stretching into a horizon he had spent years mapping out in silence. He was moving into a space that belonged entirely to him, leaving the noise of the interstate to fade into the distance.